He fired her in front of everyone. But she didn't disappear. She rebuilt. What would you do if the father of your unborn children humiliated you in front of your entire workplace and handed you a check to vanish Claire Bennett, a quiet secretary at a towering tech firm, never asked for power, but after a one-night mistake with a powerful CEO who already had a fiancé and a public image to protect, her life was shattered in a single meeting. Fired, pregnant, alone, no family to turn to, no savings. And soon, 3 mouths to feed. This is not a story of revenge. It's a story of grace under fire, of a woman who faced every closed door and quietly built her own one that opened not just for herself, but for every woman like her. What does success really mean, and when life strips you of dignity, what kind of strength rises in its place? If this story moves you, leave a comment, subscribe, or share it with someone who might need it today. Now, let's begin with a woman walking out of a glass tower, her dignity in one hand and a secret growing in the other. He fired her in front of the entire staff, but 5 years later, he'd be the one facing the spotlight and her 3 children with eyes exactly like his. Claire Bennett was the kind of woman who moved quietly through the world. At 28, she had learned how to make herself useful without being seen, efficient without drawing too much attention. For 6 years, she arrived at Halston Global's downtown Austin office at 7:20 a.m., sharp 10 minutes early, always with a travel mug of black coffee and a small notebook she never left behind. To her co-workers, she was dependable, unshakable, a pillar of calm in a workplace where tempers flared and deadlines loomed. To Richard Halston, the charismatic CEO whose face graced the covers of business magazines, Claire was just convenient. It happened after the company's annual holiday party. The office had been draped in silver and gold, laughter filling the air as champagne flowed freely. Claire had stayed later than usual, helping clean up, gathering glasses, adjusting name tags still clinging to half-empty tables. Richard appeared by the bar, his tie loosened, a gleam in his eyes. It was just a moment, an impulse, really. One glass too many. A conversation too close. A loneliness she didn't often acknowledge, colliding with charm that had been carefully sharpened over years of public appearances. They spent one night together. By Monday, the air between them had shifted. Claire said nothing, returned to her duties, and did everything in her power to forget. But 3 weeks later, when her stomach turned at the smell of coffee, she knew. The test confirmed it. Claire waited. She considered every angle. She wasn't reckless. She didn't want drama. But she believed, perhaps naively, that Richard deserved to know. Not because she wanted anything from him, just because it was the right thing to do. She asked to meet him privately, suggesting a time after hours. He agreed, with the same clipped efficiency he used with investors. But when she told him quietly, calmly, he stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. Then he laughed, a small, incredulous sound, as if she'd said something absurd. "You think I'm stupid?" he said. Claire's hands went cold. "This is your angle." "Really? Claire, you're not even the first one to try." She tried to speak, but he raised his hand. "You want to trade this for what? A promotion? A settlement? You think this'll make me break off my engagement?" Claire stood frozen. "I'll give you one chance," he said, reaching into his drawer. He pulled out a checkbook. The pen glided across the paper without hesitation. 100,000. You disappear. No lawyers, no press, no drama. Her heart broke not because he denied the child, but because he reduced a human life to a liability on his balance sheet. "I'm keeping the baby," she said softly. His eyes darkened. By morning, everyone in the office knew. He called an emergency meeting, ordered the entire executive floor into the glass-walled conference room. Claire stood among them, uncertain why she'd been called, until Richard walked in, sleeves rolled up, and pointed at her. "This company has no tolerance for manipulation or dishonesty," he began, pacing slowly. "And when someone attempts to use their position for personal leverage, we deal with it immediately." He gestured toward her as if she were a case study. "Claire Bennett has been terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort her out." She felt the air drain from the room. Heads turned. A few widened eyes, others narrowed. No one moved. Claire stood perfectly still, then turned without a word. Her desk was already packed into a small cardboard box, her nameplate, her mug with faded sunflowers, the photo of her mother from college. Someone had done it while she was in the meeting. Security didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Shame was heavier than any hand on her shoulder. At the elevator, Richard appeared again. He pressed the check into the top of her box. "Take it," he said coldly. "Consider it severance." Claire looked up at him, then down at the paper. She didn't speak. She didn't tear it. She simply closed the lid of the box and stepped inside the elevator. As the doors slid shut, she stared at her reflection. Pale, quiet, but not broken. Inside her, a life was growing 3. In fact, though she didn't know it yet. And whatever came next, she knew one thing for sure. This child would not be a secret, not a stain, not a shameful mistake, no matter what he said or how high his office windows reached. Next stop, a rusty trailer home on the outskirts of town, and a fight to survive that would demand every piece of her soul. Some endings feel like death. But for Claire, it was just the beginning of survival. The apartment Claire once called home had been emptied within a week. Boxes packed, keys returned, reputation erased, with no job, no insurance, and a growing weight in her belly. She drove her aging sedan back to the only place she could still call hers, a battered single-wide trailer parked at the edge of her childhood neighborhood in East Austin. It sat behind a half-collapsed fence, next to a cluster of sweet gum trees and rusted bicycles long abandoned. The porch light flickered when the wind blew, and the AC rattled like a cough that never healed. Inside, Margaret was waiting. Her mother had always been strong-willed, but years of dialysis had worn her down. Her face had grown pale, her wrists thin, but her voice remained sharp as ever. "Did you eat today?" she asked without looking up from her crocheting. Claire smiled faintly and nodded. She didn't mention the half-stale granola bar she'd split into 2 meals. And she didn't mention the pregnancy. Not yet. She wasn't ready to explain a night she regretted, or the humiliation that followed. She wasn't ready to say the name Richard Halston ever again. All she wanted was to stay quiet, regroup, breathe. Each morning, Claire scoured online listings for work. She sent resumes to office jobs, retail counters, call centers, grocery stores, and every time the phone rang, her heart surged with hope. But the conversations all ended the same way, polite rejections once employers learned she was dealing with personal complications. A few hinted at it directly. "You're expecting, aren't you?" one woman asked over the phone. "That's going to be difficult for scheduling." Claire hung up without replying. By the 3rd week, her savings had dipped below $600. Margaret's next dialysis treatment required a $200 copay. The fridge held little more than mustard, 2 apples, and a loaf of white bread that had started to harden. Desperation had a flavor bitter, metallic, and constant. One afternoon, while picking up a prescription for her mother, Claire noticed a help-wanted flyer taped to the side of a vending machine. Night office cleaning, 10 p.m., to 4 a.m. Must be able to lift 25 LEBs. No interview. Cash paid weekly. She tore the tab with the phone number and called before she left the pharmacy parking lot. That night, Claire began scrubbing toilets and vacuuming floor tiles in buildings she used to walk past on the way to her former office. Her back ached by midnight, her feet blistered by week's end. She didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. At the clinic, she booked her first official prenatal appointment. The nurse smiled as she prepped the ultrasound machine. "Have you been feeling extra tired?" she asked. Claire chuckled softly. "That's an understatement. Any family history of multiples?" Claire blinked. "Excuse me?" The screen lit up. The nurse paused, zoomed in, zoomed out. "Well," she said, eyes widening, "looks like we've got 3 little heartbeats in here." Claire sat upright. 3, she whispered. "Triplets," the nurse said gently. "Congratulations, Mom." The word echoed in the room. Claire didn't cry. She didn't panic. She lay back down, stared at the ceiling stained with old water rings, and let the silence wrap around her. 3 lives, 3 children, 3 futures, all depending on her. She felt the weight of it settle inside her, not just in her body, but in her soul. Her hand moved to her stomach, resting lightly. Then she whispered, not to the nurse, but to the tiny thumps of life beneath her skin, "We're going to live, all of us. I don't care how hard it gets. We will live." That night, Claire pulled out an old yellow notebook she hadn't touched since college. On the first page, she began listing expenses: rent, gas, groceries, prenatal vitamins, diapers, so many diapers. She wrote in pencil, erasing often. Every number mattered. Every cent was a decision. Every meal, every shift, every sleepless night would now be weighed against 3 little heartbeats. There was no room for bitterness, no time for regrets, only forward. And so, under the flicker of a kitchen bulb and the wheeze of a second-hand AC unit, Claire Bennett began rewriting the course of her life with a calculator in one hand and 3 reasons to survive growing inside her. How do you prepare for 3 lives when you can barely carry your own? There was no instruction manual for surviving triplets, no laminated guide for building a future with empty pockets or grieving a mother while becoming one. Claire Bennett didn't sleep much. Not because of the babies, they weren't here yet, but because the weight of their arrival pressed on her chest like a stone. By day, she scoured flea markets and church basements, gathering what she could: 3 chipped cribs with mismatched slats, a stroller that squeaked every third wheel turn, and a bundle of hand-me-down onesies faded from too many wash cycles. She picked up cloth diapers from a family leaving town and stitched them in the evenings, her fingers blistered from the needle. Every dollar was a decision, every corner of the trailer, a puzzle she had to make room in. By night, she scrubbed lobby floors and office bathrooms under buzzing fluorescent lights, her belly growing heavier with each passing week. Her supervisor offered no pity, just longer hours. Still, Claire didn't complain, not once. In the quiet between shifts, she sat at the library, flipping through thick books about infant nutrition, sleep schedules, and emergency CPR. She took notes. She memorized charts. She taught herself everything motherhood required except how to do it alone. Margaret had begun coughing more often, some days. Claire found her asleep in the kitchen, head slumped over an untouched bowl of oatmeal. Other days, she'd wake to find her mother sitting outside in the cold, staring at nothing in particular. Claire tried not to notice the shadows deepening under her mother's eyes. She wanted to believe they'd still have time for lullabies, for her mother's voice to fill the nursery with old stories and humming. But time, like so many things lately, was in short supply. It happened on a Thursday. Claire came home from the night shift, arms full of groceries, just eggs, milk, and a bruised bag of apples. She called out as usual. No answer. She found her mother still in bed, unmoving. There was no struggle, no drama, just stillness. Margaret had passed in her sleep. Her fingers curled around the rosary Claire gave her last Christmas. Claire sank to the floor beside the bed and whispered, "I wasn't ready yet. Mom." But grief didn't wait for readiness. It simply arrived and stayed. She arranged a modest service, just 10 chairs beneath a patchy oak tree at the edge of the cemetery. No flowers, just one photograph, and a folded quilt her mother had been stitching for the babies. Claire held it to her chest like it was still warm. The next weeks passed in fragments, breathing, moving, not much more. The day her water broke, she was alone at the laundromat, folding towels she'd borrowed from the shelter across the street. It was too early, 7 weeks too early. She drove herself to the hospital, gripping the wheel through each contraction. She didn't have a suitcase packed. No baby clothes, no birth plan, just an envelope of emergency contacts, none of whom could come. The doctors worked quickly. Her blood pressure was dangerously high. The babies were in distress. She was rushed into surgery. Bright lights, cold metal, hands moving fast, and then voices, crying. One, then another, then a third, smaller, raspier than the others. Claire faded in and out of consciousness, but when she awoke, all 3 lay beside her, tiny bundles wrapped in pale blue hospital blankets, their skin fragile as silk. She turned her head slowly, taking them in. 3 heartbeats, 3 mouths, 3 souls that looked impossibly real. Tears slid down her cheeks without resistance, not out of fear, not from exhaustion, but from a depth of love she had never known was possible. A nurse asked if she had names. Claire nodded. The first, with a determined scowl already forming, would be Jacob. The second, softer, fingers curled around her own, would be Eli. And the last, quiet, blinking at the ceiling like he already knew the world, he would be Luke. The machines hummed around them. The hospital lights buzzed, but Claire heard only 3 things. 3 breaths. 3 beginnings. 3 tiny voices calling her into a new life. Outside, the world continued spinning. Rent would come due. Bills would pile. The trailer would feel colder than ever. But in this sterile room, under dim light and sterile sheets, Claire Bennett had finally become something no man could take away a mother. Most mothers cradle their babies. Claire cradled her laptop too. The nights blurred together in Claire's small trailer on the east side of Austin. Cries, bottles, diapers, repeat. She could measure time not in hours, but in ounces of formula, in the soft thud of pacifiers hitting the floor, in lullabies hummed half awake through cracked lips. The boys rarely cried in unison, but there was always at least one awake. Jacob, the firstborn, demanded attention with a growl in his lungs. Eli whimpered like a violin, soft but persistent. Luke simply stared, wide-eyed, as if watching the world he'd just entered. Claire barely had 5 weeks to heal from the surgery before bills came knocking. The hospital stay had eaten into what was left of her savings. The baby formula was more expensive than she'd expected, and the electricity bill after all those cold nights warming bottles had spiked higher than she could afford. So she returned to the only job that didn't ask questions: night janitorial work in the downtown financial district from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. She scrubbed bathroom floors, emptied bins, and pushed a mop down the same hallways she used to walk in heels. Only now she wore sneakers with worn soles and a nursing pad tucked under a sweatshirt that still smelled faintly of spit-up. Andrea, a kind-hearted neighbor in the trailer park, offered to watch the boys during Claire's shifts. She was 73, diabetic, and had arthritis in both knees, but she loved babies and refused payment. "You're going to do something big one day," Andrea said one night, handing Claire a warm thermos. "You've got that tired but shining look about you." Claire laughed for the first time in weeks. After her shift, she'd come home, hold each baby close, hum to them softly, and then, when the house fell silent, open her old laptop. It was a refurbished machine, slow and prone to freezing, but it booted up faithfully. And that was all she needed. The code was still there, an unfinished personal finance app she'd started writing back in community college. She had called it Lucent Budget Simple, Clean, focused on helping low-income families track every dollar without being overwhelmed. Back then, it had been a class project. Now, it was survival. She rewrote lines of code between bottle feeds, refined graphs while the boys napped, scribbled UI sketches on the backs of diaper boxes. And then one day, while clearing her email inbox, she saw an alumni newsletter from Austin Technical College. She hadn't seen one in years. Her thumb hovered over the delete icon, but curiosity tugged. She opened it. Midway down the email, bolded in blue, it read, "Houston Startup Bridge accepting applications for women-led ventures in tech. Grants up to $25,000. Deadline 3 days from today." Claire sat frozen. 3 days. She clicked the link. The requirements were stiff prototype, business pitch, projected budget, all within 72 hours. She looked over at the bassinet. Luke stirred, then settled. Jacob's pacifier had fallen to the side. Eli was curled like a comma. Claire leaned back, closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she wasn't just exhausted, she was alive. That part of her that had once dreamed of a life in tech, that once stayed up all night perfecting code just because it brought her joy, it hadn't died. It had just been sleeping. She kissed each boy gently on the forehead. Then she opened a new window and began building. 3 nights. No sleep. She moved like a machine, feeding, burping, coding, soothing, testing. Her fingers trembled from fatigue. Her shoulders hunched over the glow of the screen. She wired up a demo version of Lucent Budget that allowed users to input weekly income, visualize spending categories, and set alerts when funds dropped too low. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. She filmed a 3-minute pitch video using her phone with a blanket duct taped to the wall behind her as a backdrop. She tried to hide the fatigue in her eyes. She smiled, even as the dark circles beneath her skin threatened to betray her. At 11:53 p.m. on the final day, with exactly 7 minutes left before the deadline, she hit submit. The screen flickered. A confirmation email arrived seconds later. Claire stared at the screen. Her hands shook. Not from fear, but from the thrill of doing something for herself again. In the quiet, she sat between 2 cribs and whispered, "We did it, boys. We really did." When the world expects you to fail, winning becomes revolutionary. Claire didn't expect the phone call. She'd almost forgotten what her own voice sounded like when it trembled with joy. "Congratulations," the woman said. "We're thrilled to offer you a spot in this year's Houston Startup Bridge and a $25,000 grant to get you going." Claire didn't answer right away. She pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. 3 tiny breaths stirred in the crib nearby. Her boys were dreaming. She whispered, "Thank you," then hung up before the emotion broke loose. Within 2 weeks, she was on a bus to Houston with her 3 children, 2 suitcases, and a printed folder labeled Lucent Budget, First Draft Vision. They arrived at a low-income extended-stay motel just off the freeway. It smelled faintly of bleach and old air conditioning, but it had 2 beds, a mini fridge, and just enough space to set up 3 foldable bassinets. Claire paid for 2 weeks in advance. The grant money wouldn't last forever. By day, she nursed and rocked her babies in shifts. She set alarms for feedings and turned the tiny kitchenette into a production line of sterilized bottles and swaddles. By night, she took the bus downtown to the incubator space glass walls, sleek desks, bright lighting that made her feel painfully visible. Most of the other participants were in their early 20s, fresh from college, dressed in tech hoodies and sneakers that cost more than her rent. They moved fast, talked fast, threw around terms like scalability and seed rounds with a casualness she envied. When she introduced herself on day one, no one asked follow-up questions. They nodded politely, eyes already drifting elsewhere. One young man leaned over and whispered to another, "She brought triplets to a startup program. That's wild." Claire heard. She just smiled. She wasn't here to fit in. She was here to build something that mattered. While others pitched ride-share platforms or AI-generated clothing apps, Claire focused on simplicity. Lucent Budget wasn't flashy. It was made for real people like her mother, who used envelopes to budget weekly bills, like the single mom 2 rooms down at the motel who'd asked if Claire had an extra bottle warmer. She built the interface with that woman in mind. Large buttons, clear categories, simple reports in plain English, no jargon, no tricks. One afternoon, while balancing Luke in her lap and finalizing a demo version, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Mr. Grayson, a tall man with silver hair and a presence that silenced a room when he entered. He was on the board of the incubator, rarely spoke, mostly observed. "I've been reviewing your trial data," he said. "I see you ran a small beta group." Claire nodded, surprised. "Yes, I tested it with 7 families from the shelter nearby. Just wanted to see if the features made sense." He smiled faintly. They did more than make sense. The retention rate was 91% in 3 weeks. Claire blinked. "That's higher than I expected." Grayson glanced at the sleeping baby in her arms. "You know, most people build apps for people like themselves. You built one for people no one sees." She didn't know how to respond. He handed her a card. "If you're open to it, I'd like to talk investment. We need more founders like you." Claire watched him walk away, the weight of his words heavier than the baby resting against her shoulder. For the first time in a long time, she let herself feel it, not fear, not exhaustion, but the flicker of something powerful. Hope. That night, after feeding the boys and folding the last tiny onesie, Claire sat at the desk in their motel room. She stared at her screen, then typed a new heading, Lucent Budget, Our Beginning. She wasn't just building an app. She was building a tool for mothers who couldn't afford mistakes, for caregivers balancing overdue bills and medications, for people like her mom whose last months were clouded by paperwork she couldn't make sense of. Claire didn't want to make millions. She wanted to make it easier for someone to sleep at night knowing rent was covered. And maybe, just maybe, to make the world see women like her not as fragile, but as fierce. In a city she barely knew, with 3 babies sleeping nearby and the faint hum of traffic outside, Claire Bennett began again, not as a statistic, not as a sob story, but as a founder, a mother, a force. She built a company, but her ghosts never left the room. There were moments, brief, breathless moments, when Claire Bennett forgot. Forgot the fluorescent lights of that glass conference room. Forgot the sting of a check sliding across a cardboard box. Forgot the silence of an elevator ride with shame tucked under her arm. But forgetting and healing weren't the same thing. And ghosts, well, they always found a way back. It began with a meeting, one of many she now attended, not as a secretary in the corner, but as a founder at the table. Claire had grown into this role. She still wore her thrifted sweaters and practical jeans, but her posture had changed. She walked into rooms with numbers, projections, outcomes, no apologies. That morning, she was reviewing possible partners for expansion funding. A quiet man from the finance team passed her a document across the table, preliminary research on potential competitors turned collaborators. At the top of the list, Halston Global. She hadn't spoken that name aloud in over 4 years. Her hand froze over the page. They were floundering. The report detailed declining user trust, bad press over unethical data tracking, and a recent lawsuit over internal harassment. Revenue had dropped 37% in 6 months. She read the report twice, then once more, just to make sure it was real. Richard Halston's name was still on the board, but it was clear he was losing control of the company, of the narrative, of everything he'd once believed untouchable. Claire closed the folder quietly. Her coffee had gone cold. That night, she couldn't sleep. The motel room was too quiet, even with the hum of the mini fridge and the soft breathing of her boys. In her dreams, she was back in that boardroom, the same polished table, the same fluorescent lights. Only this time, she wasn't standing alone. She turned and saw Jacob, Eli, and Luke behind her, watching, their eyes wide, waiting. When she woke, her pillow was damp with sweat. Her heart ached in that old, familiar way. She sat up slowly and opened her laptop. There was still grant money left. There were new investors. There were options. And now, there was an opening. She didn't want revenge. She wanted control, not of Richard, not even of Halston Global, but of her own story, of the narrative he once twisted and used to crush her. By morning, she had a plan. She reached out to Grayson, the seasoned investor who had first believed in Lucent Budget. He had contacts, experience, the kind of reach she needed. "I want to acquire a stake," she said over the phone, "but I want to stay anonymous." There was a pause on the line. "Personal?" he asked gently. She nodded, knowing he could hear it in her voice. "I understand," he said. "Leave it with me. Within 2 weeks." Claire stood in a modest Houston office, not her usual co-working space, but one rented under a legal trust. A neutral intermediary. No one knew her name. Not yet. The papers were laid out carefully. She had reviewed every line, 42%. Enough to gain serious leverage, enough to make decisions, enough to be impossible to ignore. Claire picked up the pen. Her hand trembled for a split second, not from fear, not anymore, from weight, of what it meant to return not to the past, but to the point where it had all begun. She signed, initialed, dated. Just like that, she became the second largest shareholder of Halston Global, not with noise, not with fury, with quiet precision. Outside, the city moved on honking cars, office towers blinking to life, investors sipping coffee behind glass walls. But in that room, Claire reclaimed something more valuable than ownership. She reclaimed her voice. She left with shame. She returns with power. The invitation arrived printed on thick ivory stock, sealed in gold foil, and tucked into an envelope with her name engraved in calligraphy. Claire Bennett, founder and CEO of Lucent Budget, was formally invited to speak at the National Finance Innovation Summit in Boston. She read the words twice. 5 years ago, she had been escorted out of a boardroom like a scandal. Now, she was being asked to address the room. Her assistant, Nora, scanned the guest list with a raised brow. "Guess who else will be there?" she said, tilting the screen toward Claire. There he was, Richard Halston, keynote leadership in a changing economy. Claire didn't flinch. Boston was where Halston Global had moved its corporate headquarters. It was also where she'd planned never to return. But this wasn't the same Claire who once stood silent while her world collapsed. She had 3 reasons to rise now, and they all had their father's eyes. Claire chartered a private flight not out of ego, but necessity. 3 toddlers, 2 nannies, a legal aid, and her co-founder Andrea made a tight travel group. Jacob insisted on sitting near the window, pressing his forehead to the glass. Eli napped with his stuffed bear. Luke asked if Boston had pancakes. Claire smiled. Yes, pancakes. And something even better closure. She booked a suite with adjoining rooms at a historic hotel just blocks from the conference venue. When they arrived, she unpacked more than luggage. She unpacked 5 years of quiet endurance. The morning of the summit. Claire dressed in a tailored navy suit, her hair pinned back, her features soft but steady. In the mirror, she saw someone her younger self would have admired, not because of success, but because of strength. The ballroom buzzed with media, executives, venture capitalists. Everyone was revolutionizing something. Claire's panel was scheduled after the keynote. She waited offstage, sipping water, while Richard Halston took the podium. He looked older, not in the lines of his face, but in the wear of his voice. Still polished, still charismatic. But there was a tension under the charm, a man holding on too tightly to a narrative slipping through his fingers. He spoke about change, resilience, innovation. Claire watched, arms crossed. He didn't recognize her yet. She was just another face backstage, just another success story he hadn't read closely. When it was her turn, she stepped to the microphone without notes. "My name is Claire Bennett," she began, voice even. "I built Lucent Budget from a motel room with 3 newborns asleep beside me. I didn't have a team. I didn't have funding. I had desperation and a spreadsheet." The audience leaned in. "I didn't create a product to impress venture capital. I created it so people like my mother wouldn't cry over overdue utility bills ever again." Applause rippled. In the front row, Richard finally looked up. Their eyes met. His face twitched, not with surprise, but something colder. Recognition. And the fear that comes with it. After the panel, cameras flashed as reporters rushed forward. Claire answered questions about growth, user retention, and social impact. Then, one journalist stepped closer, glancing toward the boys playing quietly with Andrea near the refreshment table. "Ms. Bennett," he asked gently, "your son's handsome boys. Are they by any chance related to Mr. Halston?" Silence fell like glass. Claire looked at the reporter, then at the audience, then at her sons. Jacob looked up. His eyes were Richard's. Eli tilted his head, curious. Luke smiled and waved. Claire didn't say a word. She didn't need to, because truth sometimes doesn't require a voice, only a moment. And in that moment, the silence said everything. Later, as they walked through the Boston Public Garden, Jacob tugged her hand. "Mom, was that the man from your bad dreams?" Claire paused. She knelt beside him. "No, baby," she said. "Bad dreams don't scare us anymore. Some reckonings don't come with rage, but with truth, plain and undeniable." The morning sun spilled through the arched windows of the conference hall, casting long shadows across the stage. Claire sat in the green room behind the curtain, watching the seconds tick past on her watch. Her breath was steady, her hands folded in her lap. Across from her, Nora leaned in, phone in hand. "They're ready," she whispered. Claire nodded. "Activate the final purchase." Nora tapped the screen and sent the signal to their legal team across town. With that, Lucent Budget's trust officially acquired the remaining 9% of Halston Global. Claire now owned controlling interest, and no one, not even Richard Halston, knew it yet. She stood, smoothing the lines of her navy jacket, the same one she'd worn to her very first investor meeting. "You ready?" Nora asked. Claire gave a soft smile. "I've been ready since the day he handed me that check." The room was packed over 400 executives, journalists, and investors, all eager to witness the day's marquee event, Legacy vs. Innovation Building, the Future of Finance. With two guests of honor, Richard Halston and Claire Bennett, Richard was already seated, one leg crossed over the other, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. He looked confident, camera ready. But when Claire stepped onto the stage, flanked by the soft echo of applause, his jaw tensed ever so slightly. She took her seat opposite him. The moderator began with pleasantries, guiding the conversation through early journeys, leadership philosophies, and visions for ethical technology. Claire spoke calmly, candidly about data transparency, financial dignity, and building tools for people who live paycheck to paycheck. Richard responded with polished charm, referencing global scalability and market repositioning. Then, halfway through the session, a small, unmistakable sound rose from the back of the hall. Daddy three little voices, clear, innocent, and undeniable. All heads turned. Jacob Eli and Luke broke away from Andrea's grasp and hurried down the carpeted aisle, their matching dress shirts untucked, their hair still damp from morning baths. They reached the edge of the stage and looked up with expectant eyes. Claire stood. The room held its breath. Richard froze. The moderator blinked, confused. Are these? Claire took a single step forward. "My sons," she said, her voice warm but unwavering. "They've never needed anything from anyone, but today they came to see what dignity looks like up close." The boys waved. Richard's hands remained motionless in his lap. A camera clicked, then another. The moderator, flustered, tried to pivot. Well, that's certainly unexpected. But perhaps we could return to the subject of ownership and future strategy. Claire turned, calmly taking the microphone. "You're right," she said. "Let's talk ownership." She looked toward the audience. This morning, Lucent Budget acquired the remaining 9% stake in Halston Global, bringing our total to 51%. A hush fell over the room. One man coughed. A woman's hand flew to her mouth. Claire continued, "As of 9:02 a.m., this company no longer belongs to a legacy. It belongs to a future where accountability, transparency, and access matter." She glanced at Richard, her expression steady. No more spin, no more shadows. Richard's face remained impassive, but the color in his cheeks drained. He rose slowly from his seat, adjusted his cufflinks, and stepped down from the stage. No words, no rebuttal, no applause. The doors closed quietly behind him. Claire stood alone at the center of the stage, not as someone who'd won, but as someone who'd endured. A few moments passed in silence. Then, the audience rose, not in frenzy, but in quiet, resolute recognition. One by one, they stood, for her, for the journey, for the reckoning. Backstage, Jacob tugged at her hand. "Mom, why was that man so quiet?" Claire knelt down, brushing his hair back gently. "Sometimes," she said, "people have nothing to say when the truth finally arrives. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply living free." The new Halston Global headquarters was quieter than Claire remembered. Not physically. The elevators still dinged. The air vents still hummed. The glass walls still gleamed under polished chrome lights. But something had shifted. The energy, the weight, the narrative. This was no longer the empire of Richard Halston. This was hers now. The sign above the entryway had changed 2 days ago. Halston Lucent, the merger name voted on unanimously by the new board. It was a subtle gesture keeping the past, but anchoring it to something more grounded, more human. Claire Bennett, CEO. That title still made her chest tighten, not from nerves, but from memory. She'd never imagined this future, not in the early days with milk-stained sweaters and overdue bills. But here it was. And today, she'd finish what she came to do. The meeting was private. Just Claire, Richard, 2 legal advisors who stood silently near the corners of the room, present only by protocol. Richard sat at the end of the mahogany table where he used to command every eye. Now, his tie was looser, his posture uncertain. He looked at Claire with something between recognition and restraint. "I assume you wanted this in person," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Claire nodded. Calm. Yes. She reached into her bag, not for a contract, not for a folder, but for an envelope. Slim. Creased. Untouched. She slid it across the table. Richard glanced down. His eyes narrowed. It was the same envelope he'd given her nearly 5 years ago. The check still inside. Uncashed. $100,000. Blood money. He picked it up slowly, then set it down with a faint tap. "You never used it." Claire shook her head gently. "I didn't need it, not after I realized it came from fear." He didn't answer. There wasn't much to say. She continued, voice steady. "I didn't come here to humiliate you. That already happened on its own. I came here to close the door you once slammed open." He looked up at her, then not with anger, but something resembling grief. "You could have destroyed me." Claire's smile was soft, almost sad. "I didn't want to destroy anyone," she said. "I just wanted to build something honest and keep my children safe." He leaned back, eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the city kept moving, cars below, people crossing streets, life continuing. The same way it had the day she left this building, with a cardboard box in her arms and a fire quietly forming in her chest. Now, that fire was no longer about pain. It was purpose. The door opened behind her. Jacob peeked in first, holding Luke's hand. Eli followed, shy but curious, their sneakers quiet on the carpeted floor. Claire turned to them and smiled, ready to go. They nodded in unison. She walked to the door, her heels tapping gently, each step echoing not with vengeance, but clarity. Before leaving, she looked back once, not at Richard, but at the chair where she used to sit years ago. Smaller, quieter, invisible, not anymore. As they walked through the hallway, one of the receptionists whispered to her coworker, "That's her, right, the woman who owns it all." Now Claire didn't turn. She didn't need to. The boys skipped ahead, laughing over who would get pancakes first. Luke pointed at the elevator buttons like they were magic. Eli held Claire's hand. Jacob pressed close, whispering, "You okay?" "Mom." She bent down and kissed his forehead. "I'm better than okay. Honey." They stepped into the elevator together. As the doors slid shut, Claire looked ahead toward the future. No more courtrooms, no more boardrooms full of judgment, no more checks with strings, only mornings with her boys, evenings with her work, and peace, quiet, earned, whole. Behind her, the past remained seated at that long table, but Claire walked away with something far greater than a title. She walked away free. Success isn't always a mansion. Sometimes it's a quiet dinner with the ones who love you. The house wasn't grand. No marble countertops, no sweeping staircase, no gates or guards, just a porch with white-painted wood, a front yard that smelled of pine after rain, and a kitchen window that caught the last light of every sunset. Claire Bennett had looked at dozens of listings after stepping away from Halston, Saskatchewan-Lucent. Boston, Austin, even Seattle, but Vermont quiet. Unassuming Vermont kept calling her name. She found the house by accident. A faded yellow colonial tucked off a dirt road, once owned by a retired school teacher, 3 bedrooms, a writing nook, and a garden just wild enough to feel alive. It was perfect, not because of what it had, but because of what it didn't. No boardrooms, no headlines, no shadows, just space. For breathing, for baking, for beginning again on her terms. Claire stepped back from public life a month after finalizing the merger. There was no press conference, no farewell post, just a short letter to her team, thanking them for believing in dignity and building something honest. She donated her salary's final installment to a new foundation, the Lucent Mothers Fund, offering free coding courses, childcare stipends, and job placement support for single mothers. It was her way of reaching backward with both hands open, because no one gets anywhere alone, and because no woman should have to choose between survival and self-worth. Her days now followed a new rhythm. Mornings began with pancakes and little feet running across cold wooden floors. Jacob, always first to rise, would read beside her on the porch. Eli asked 100 questions during breakfast, most of them about birds. And Luke danced when he was happy, which was often after school drop-off. Claire wrote, not code, stories. She had started a memoir not for fame, but for closure, titled In the Quiet, We Rise. It traced the arc from cardboard boxes to conference stages, not skipping the messy middle. Andrea, now semi-retired and living nearby, visited weekly. She still insisted on folding laundry. Nora ran the foundation full-time, sending updates with photos of women who reminded Claire of who she once was. Tired, terrified, relentless. The past came knocking only once. A letter, handwritten, no return address. From Richard, inside. No apology, but 3 words. Thank you anyway. She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Forgiveness, she had learned, didn't always require a conversation. Sometimes it was simply choosing peace over pain every single day. That evening, the kitchen glowed golden with dinner nearly ready. Macaroni, green beans, soft rolls, nothing fancy, but everything warm. Claire moved between counters with music humming low. The boys set the table, 1 spoon at a time, negotiating who got the blue cup. When they sat down, Luke reached for her hand first, then Jacob, then Eli. Small fingers, so much history. After Grace, as butter melted on warm bread. Jacob looked up with those ever-familiar eyes. Mommy, he said, we're proud of you. She paused, a breath caught somewhere between heart and throat. Not because she hadn't heard praise before, but because this was the only version that ever truly mattered. She reached across the table, touching each of their hands in turn. Thank you, she whispered, for being my reason. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the boys tucked under blankets that smelled of lavender, Claire stood alone in the doorway of the kitchen. The lights were still on, soft, gentle, steady. She looked around at the scratched wooden table, the fridge covered in finger paintings, the chipped mug holding 3 pencils, and a daisy. This wasn't a castle. It was better. It was hers, in the hush of twilight. Claire closed her eyes and let the quiet settle in like an old friend. No more battles, no more proving, just the rustle of trees outside, the ticking of the wall clock, and 3 sleeping hearts upstairs that loved her without condition. She smiled. This, she thought, is my empire, in a world that often rewards power, noise, and quick success. Claire's journey reminds us of something far more enduring: quiet resilience. She didn't fight back with anger. She didn't seek revenge. She chose dignity when she had every reason not to. She chose to rise quietly, not to prove anyone wrong, but to build something right. For those of us who've known what it means to lose, to start over, or to carry the weight of silent battles, Claire's story is a gentle reminder. Strength isn't always loud. Victory doesn't always look like applause. Sometimes it's a warm kitchen, a child's hand in yours, or a night's sleep without regret. Your worth is never defined by who hurt you, but by how you choose to heal. So wherever you are in life, beginning again, holding on, or letting go, may you find courage in the quietest corners of your own heart, because even in silence, you are still growing. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who might need a little light today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more healing stories to life. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and stay connected.